Taxi drivers and operators affiliated with CATA and CODETA taxi associations have brought Cape Town to a standstill. They've downed tools to march to Western Cape Premier Alan Windey's offices to air their grievances over costly impoundments and fines. Commuters have been left stranded as a result. We've got our reporters Monique Motlock and Nobesutu Hechana in Cape Town on the ground. They are tracking this developing story for us today. Monique, let's begin with you. I mean, earlier we saw the march happening and the taxis were not on the move. What is the latest you can tell us?
Well, right now things are quiet, but it was a different scene, especially here in Bonteheuwel on Jakes Gerwel Drive earlier this morning when several taxis were stoned while they were trying to pick up passengers. I'm going to ask my colleague Zaid just to show you to the left of me. We still see a heavy police presence in the area. Police vehicles are positioned at different entrances of Bonteheuwel just to ensure that if there are any more flare-ups as the day goes on, especially as we're heading towards peak hour traffic, that they are in position to react should it be needed. A little earlier, we were also in Nyanga speaking to commuters there, and also in Cape Town at the Golden Arrow bus terminus, where commuters were expressing their frustration and their anger over the taxi strike. Many of them saying that today's taxi strike is not only impacting their ability to get to work or to college, but it's also impacting their pockets. But to tell us about the overall impact here in Bonteheuwel especially, I'm speaking to Ward Councillor Angus McKenzie. Just explain to us, you mentioned a little earlier about the old age home that was even impacted. Tell us about how the strike has affected services.
Look, I think up front we need to say that we respect people's right to protest. But I think where I lose complete respect, and I think where community as a whole loses complete respect, is when the protest action morphs out to what it morphed out to be this morning, the anarchy that it was. It has affected every single community across the Cape this morning. We had our old age homes in the area not being able to go and collect their medicines and supplies for old age people because the vehicles that they were driving were seen to look like taxis and were being threatened to stone. Our children couldn't get to school today. A lot of our kids in Bonteheuwel go to school outside of Bonteheuwel, so they were unable to go to school today. And more than anything, we already live in a society that is buckled by poverty, and people are working really hard for the little bit that they have and losing a day's wages because people have acted in the manner in which they've acted is completely unacceptable. And I think the ripple effect of that is so much worse. So while we do respect people's right to protest, I cannot respect what happened this morning. We cannot condone. We must condemn what the taxi drivers did this morning. It's completely unacceptable. And I think the biggest fear for us now is when peak hour starts in the next hour or two, what will happen. And so what we've done specifically in Bonteheuwel is we've ensured a heightened police presence. As you've seen, we've 3 entrances to Bonteheuwel, so on Valhalla Drive side and then the 2 entrances on Jakes Gerwel. So we've been able to secure those quite well. So if there are buses that are going to be coming into Bonteheuwel, those buses should be safe and should have no problem coming in and out of Bonteheuwel. Unfortunately, our taxi association in Bonteheuwel, which I must commend, because despite the actions of CODETA and CATA, our Bonteheuwel Taxi Association decided today that they wanted to service the community. They have a responsibility towards this community, and they did that. But to a certain point, after 5 of their vehicles were stoned this morning en route to taking commuters up and down, they had to suspend their services. So as it stands, that suspension has not been lifted because the threat is still real. And I think what I respect most about the Bonteheuwel Taxi Association in this regard is that it's not so much about their vehicle, it is more about their commuters and the safety of their commuters. And so I respect the fact that they've suspended that services, and if need be, unfortunately, people have to find alternative ways to travel back home to Bonteheuwel this evening.
Thank you very much. Ward Councillor Angus McKenzie answering all the questions I was going to ask about what we can be expecting once peak hour traffic arrives, and that should be after 3, after 4, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye out not only on Bonteheuwel but also on your Nyanga, Khayelitsha, Langa areas where it's likely that even though the taxi drivers this morning, they did say that they will resume operations for this afternoon, but we will see how things go. go, because as we heard from some commuters this morning, there is that fear or that concern that should they get into a taxi, they don't know how safe they're going to be, and many of them, as Ward Councillor Mackenzie mentioned, will have to try and find alternative modes of transport.
Yeah, thank you, Monique. Let's just bring in Nobesuthu Hechana. Nobesuthu, I don't know how much of that you could hear, but of course we do know commuters are fearful, they've been negatively affected, but the taxi drivers, the taxi industry there in Cape Town, feeling that they've got legitimate grievances around these fines, which they believe are very high, and the impoundments of their vehicles.
Certainly, Braden. In fact, before we get to the grievances and that memorandum that was handed over to the office of the Premier, I'm actually joined by two commuters, Usis Fikiswa and Usis Lungiswa, Bashala a Crossroad. Sisi, can you tell us about your trip this morning? How was it?
Yo sisi bekunzima kakhulu nokuxelela because ke xa uyokhwela ibhasi pha ikushiya ngosowufikile pha kodwa ubufike early. So sentsho bekunzima kakhulu into engayithatha kuba bekunzima this morning.
And sisifikiswa sibonile ibhasi itshiswe nyanga, mhlambi benindawo nina and kwaye benikhuseleke kangakanani?
Mna sisi ndihlala eBella andihlala eCrossroad. Ndiye ndayifumana ibhasi khange ibe nangxaki, khange bekho problem ngela xesha. Ndifumana ibhasi ka5:30. Khange ndibe na problem. Ndize ndizofika apha emsebenzini ndeva ke ngokuba abantu banengxaki eCrossroad, ii-colleagues zam zakwazi zafika late emsebenzini. Yayibona bafike late nakhange ndibe na problem. Kuloyiko lam ke ngokuba ndizawuphinda ngantoni ngoku. Yabo ngoba ndisebenzisa ibhasi vele andisebenzisi itaxi azikho eBella, funeka ndithathe itaxi eBella ndiye eDelft. That's why ndisebenzisa ibhasi.
And sisilungiswa sibonile mhlambi nala bhasi busithi itshiswe phambi kwakho, beningoyiki and kwaye amapolisa bebekhona ukunikhusela?
Sisi besisoyika, to be honest, besisoyika, but ke lento yenzekileyo ne ibhasi ibisemveni kwethu, not bingakho ngaphambi kwami, ibisemveni kwethu. So thina sizova nje ngezikhalo ezitshoyo emveni kwethu. Otherwise besisoyika ukoyiko. Wa usakhwele ebhasini uyoyika kaloku because awuyazi noba uzawufika na emsebenzini okanye awuzofika.
Njengoba ngoku nileqe yokhwela ibhasi mhlambi niziva njani?
Sinalo uloyiko kodwa ke ekugqibeleni ke asizulala lapha kaloku. Yaqonda bafuneka sigodukile siye ezindlini zethu. So sinalo uloyiko sinalo kodwa ke sizawubona pha phambili xa sifike eterminus siba siza kwenza njani. But enye indlela ke asinayo yoba singawufika ngayo ezindlini zethu.
Sibulele kakhulu bosisibam. Well, Braden, Usislungiswa and Sisfikiswa are just telling me about what happened this morning. Usislungiswa traveling from a crossroad, saying that the bus that they were traveling in was in front of the one that was torched this morning, because we heard from Golden Arrow confirming that 3 of their buses were torched in Nyanga and Kraaifontein in Bloekombos. But when it comes to that memorandum that was submitted to the office of the Premier, some of the key issues that were mentioned by the operators and the taxi bosses was that they want the city to stop impounding their taxis, and also they feel like it's expensive to release those vehicles that have been impounded. And they also mentioned that they have an issue with the fines that when they're traveling or when they're driving on the yellow line, they're being fined close to, some were saying that even at around about 3.5, which is expensive for them. So they went to the Premier's office, but unfortunately the Premier was not there to receive their grievances. They had to hand over their memorandum to a senior official there, and they were not happy with that, saying that the Premier knew exactly that they were supposed to be there at 11:30 because this was a planned and a permitted march by the taxi operators. But we know that operations are expected to resume tomorrow morning. Also, the operators saying that they'll be meeting with their lawyers tomorrow at 9 to find out if there are any possible ways that they can escalate their grievances. But they did say that they are not in support of those violent actions we've seen this morning. In fact, distancing themselves from those actions and saying that should anyone be should anyone be held, they will be taking that person to police or the law enforcement officers so that those people can be punished. We saw visuals this morning of a taxi being stoned along the N2, and there was also people or commuters who were forced to vacate or leave that taxi because they are being threatened by the taxi operators and the drivers.
Okay, thank you very much, Nobesuthu Hechana and Monique Mortlock. Thankfully, at this stage, as you've told us, both of you, things are quiet, but commuters are anxious about how they're going to get back home later today. We'll keep track of the developments there. Monique Mortlock and Nobesuthu Hechana in Cape Town.